Can you fix our door? Mommy's crying. Lila's whisper reached Alaric Nightborn before she did, a sound too small for human ears, yet it pierced through wrought iron gates and centuries of careful restraint. He had lived lifetimes without answering prayers. But this one found him anyway. The houses on this block stood shoulder to shoulder beneath old street lamps that cast more shadow than light. Most had been built in the same decade, shared the same cracked sidewalks, the same weary history. But there was a line, unmarked yet unmistakable, between one end of the street and the other. At the far corner stood the Nightborn Manor. Before we step into Alaric's world tonight, I need to ask you something. Have you ever felt utterly alone, standing at a broken door, wondering if anyone would hear you if you asked for help? This story is about that moment and what happens when someone finally answers. If you're ready for a tale about ancient vows, midnight courage, and the kind of protection that asks for nothing in return, then stay with me. And if this story moves you the way it moved me while writing it, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow, I'm bringing you another story that will make you feel something real. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. I love knowing this community spans the whole world. Now, let's meet a little girl brave enough to knock on a vampire king's door at midnight. It did not look abandoned, exactly. The grounds were immaculate, the hedges trimmed with inhuman precision. The gate never rusted, the windows never dusty, yet no one ever saw lights move inside. The house existed like a held breath, present, aware, but separate from the rhythm of the neighborhood. People called it the old place at the end, though few could say how old or who really lived there. Alaric Nightborn was a name some knew, though none could say where they'd learned it. He was perhaps in his late 30s, perhaps older. It was hard to tell in the rare glimpses neighbors caught of him. Pale, composed, always dressed as though attending something formal, even when simply standing in his garden at dusk. They did not know he heard every word spoken on the block, every argument, every prayer, every stifled sob. Just across the narrow street, a rental house leaned slightly away from the curb as if trying to distance itself from its own decay. Paint peeled in long strips. The porch sagged under its own weight. And the door had given up trying to close properly years ago. Inside lived Evelyn Moore and her daughter, Lila. The door's wooden frame had warped from seasons of neglect and weather. The lock jammed more often than it turned. To close it at night, Evelyn had to pull with both hands, brace her foot against the threshold, and grunt it into place. Even then, a gap remained at the top, a thin seam that whistled when wind passed through, letting cold creep across the floor like an unwelcome visitor. She had thought about fixing it, many times. But rent came first, groceries second, and everything else, the door, the leaking faucet, the window that wouldn't latch, had to wait. Always waiting. That morning, the rain had paused, but the air still bit with cold. Evelyn tugged Lila's hood up over her curls and buttoned the top button of her small coat before they stepped outside. Cold, huh? Evelyn murmured, tucking her own scarf tighter with one hand while holding Lila's small fingers with the other. Lila nodded. Her boots made soft taps on the wet pavement. They walked toward the main road where the school bus would arrive. Evelyn's mind buzzed. Last night's shift had stretched too long, and she'd barely slept. The image of the door rattling in its frame kept returning, a sound that felt less like wind and more like warning. Up ahead, near the corner, Alaric was locking his gate. He moved with the same precise grace he always did, coat perfectly pressed, silver hair tied back, movements smooth and deliberate as though the world ran on his schedule, not the other way around. He did not glance toward them. Evelyn lowered her gaze slightly. Just another neighbor passing by. But Lila let go of her mother's hand. She took 2 quick steps forward, stopped a few feet from the gate, tilted her head back, and said, calmly, clearly, with a kind of honesty only children possess, "Can you fix our door? Mommy's crying." Evelyn froze. The words struck her like a hand pressed over her mouth, exposing something private, something she'd worked so hard to keep hidden. Heat flooded her face. "Lila, She rushed forward, scooping her daughter into her arms, holding her a little too tightly. "I'm so sorry," Evelyn said, voice unsteady, eyes fixed somewhere past Alaric's shoulder. She says things sometimes. I didn't mean to bother you." Alaric did not move. Evelyn's heart pounded. She had learned long ago that people like him, people whose homes didn't leak, whose gates didn't rust, whose lives ran smoothly behind closed doors, did not want to be part of messy, broken lives like hers. Without waiting for a response, she turned and walked away, faster than necessary, clutching Lila against her chest. Lila looked over her mother's shoulder, confused. She did not understand why the moment had felt so heavy, why her mother's hands were shaking. Alaric remained by his gate. He did not call out, did not promise anything. But the child's words echoed louder than the wind. "Mommy's crying." He had heard crying before. Centuries of it. Enough that he'd learned to filter it out, to let the world's suffering pass by like rain against glass, present, but not his concern. But this was different. A door that would not close. A mother too proud to ask for help. A child small enough to still believe that asking might work. He stood there longer than he intended, staring at the space where they'd been, feeling something stir beneath layers of cold pragmatism and ancient restraint. Something uncomfortably close to responsibility. That night, the storm returned. Wind howled through the streets, rattling windows and bending trees. Rain fell in sheets, drumming against rooftops with relentless force. Inside the Nightborn Manor, Alaric sat by the window in perfect stillness. His walls did not creak. His lights did not flicker. The silence inside was absolute. But through the rain-blurred glass, across the narrow street, he saw the light in Evelyn's window flicker. And he saw the door, trembling in its frame, moving just slightly, not open but unstable, as though deciding whether to hold or finally surrender. He set down the book he hadn't been reading. For a long moment, he did nothing. Centuries of discipline told him not to interfere. The world did not need kings anymore. It needed distance, restraint. But the child's voice returned. "Can you fix our door?" Alaric stood. He reached for his coat, long, black, tailored, and pulled it on. He moved through the manor's hallway and opened a cabinet that hadn't been touched in decades. Inside, tools. Not for show. For use. He lifted the case, tested its weight, and paused once at his own door. Then he stepped into the night. The rain had not stopped. It fell in thin, steady sheets, swept sideways by wind that howled through the gaps between houses. The sky was a deep slate, lit only by brief flashes of distant lightning. Inside the rental, Evelyn sat on the edge of the couch, gently rocking Lila, humming low, trying to ease her into sleep despite the storm. The little girl stirred but did not fuss. The wind pressed against the walls, like something trying to find a way in. Then a knock. Soft. Not hurried. Not aggressive. Just enough to be heard over the storm. Evelyn froze, her pulse spiking. She laid Lila down gently, tucked the blanket close, and moved toward the door. Through the small glass pane at the top, she saw a silhouette, tall, still, impossibly composed despite the rain. She opened the door just a crack. Alaric stood there. His coat clung wet to one shoulder. In his hand was a case of tools, old but well-maintained. No umbrella, no smile, just calm. "I came to look at the door," he said, his voice steady, neither warm nor cold. "If now isn't a good time, I can return later." Evelyn hesitated. Every instinct told her this was strange, dangerous even. But Lila had been calm this morning, and the door was broken. She opened it wider. It's okay. Thank you." Alaric stepped onto the porch, but did not cross the threshold. He turned toward the door, studying it with eyes that saw more than wood and rust. "The top hinge is offset," he said quietly, gesturing. "I can fix it from here." Evelyn stood to the side, arms crossed, not from cold, but from habit. She watched him carefully. He did not glance into the house, did not ask invasive questions. His attention stayed on the door, the frame, the task. It was a small thing, but it settled something in her chest. Behind her, Lila peeked through the edge of the curtain, watching the stranger work. Alaric crouched near the lower hinge. For a moment he paused. His fingers brushed the splintered wood, the rusted latch, the cold that seeped through the gap. It reminded him too vividly of another night. Another door. A woman standing behind it, holding fear behind a tired smile. His mother. He blinked once, shook his head faintly as if releasing the memory, and said softly, "Could you shine a light here?" Evelyn nodded. She took out her phone, turned on the flashlight, and held it just above his shoulder, angling it carefully so it lit the metal without blinding him. The rain started to fall harder. Without a word, Evelyn stepped away and returned with a worn umbrella. She opened it gently and held it over him, just enough to shelter his hands. One side of her sweater was soon soaked. Neither of them spoke. There was only the sound of wind, rain tapping against the porch, and the soft click of tools against metal. Alaric worked slowly, precisely, not as though he were repairing a door, but as though he were restoring something far more fragile. When he finished tightening the final screw, he stood and tested the door. It moved smoothly, closed cleanly. The gap at the top had disappeared. Evelyn reached forward, pushed it gently. It settled into place with a soft, final sound. No rattle, no whistle. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her voice caught. "Thank you. No one's ever helped with something like this before." Alaric gave a slight shake of his head, closing the toolbox with quiet finality. "Everyone deserves a door that closes properly," he said. Matter of fact. Like stating the weather. He reached into his coat pocket and placed something on the small table beside the door. A card. No number. No title. Just a name, written in elegant script. Alaric Nightborn. Across the street. Then, with a polite nod, he stepped down into the rain and crossed back toward the manor. Evelyn stood in the doorway, watching until the night swallowed him whole. She closed the door slowly behind her. For the first time in years, it stayed shut. Lila pressed her small hand against the door, feeling its stillness. "He fixed it," she whispered. Evelyn knelt beside her daughter, brushing damp hair from her forehead. "Yes, sweetheart. He did." But as she looked at the card on the table, at the name written in ink that seemed too old for modern paper, Evelyn wondered what kind of man crossed the street in a storm to fix a stranger's door. And more troubling still, why now? What she did not know, what she could not know, was that Alaric Nightborn had not fixed a door in over 300 years. Not since the night he failed to repair one that mattered, and the consequences taught him that kings do not kneel. Until tonight. Until a child reminded him that some oaths are older than crowns. Alaric had sensed the child before she reached his gate. Her heartbeat arrived first, small, quick, determined, cutting through the layered symphony of the neighborhood's nocturnal rhythm. It moved with purpose, not the wandering pace of a lost child, but the focused stride of someone on a mission. He tracked her across the street, felt her hesitate at the curb, then continue forward. He stood in the shadow of his entrance hall, one hand resting against the doorframe, listening. The gate was locked, iron, older than the house itself, woven with wards that whispered warnings to anyone who approached with ill intent. But the child's presence triggered nothing. No alarms. No resistance. She simply stood there, waiting. And then she spoke. "Can you fix our door? Mommy's crying." The words landed like stones dropped into still water, sending ripples through centuries of carefully maintained distance. Alaric closed his eyes. Two choices. Both are impossible. He could ignore her, pretend not to hear, let the child return home, and let the door remain broken. It was safer that way, for her mother, for the fragile peace he'd built by staying separate. Intervention always costs more than people understand. Always. But ignoring her would break something older than his restraint. A vow buried so deep he'd almost convinced himself it had eroded with time. Protect the unguarded. Not as subjects. As neighbors. He had been a king once. Kings commanded. They did not kneel. They did not lower themselves to the height of children or concern themselves with broken latches on rental doors. Power demanded elevation, and elevation demanded distance. But before he had been a king, he had been something simpler. A son who watched his mother brace a broken door every night. Alaric opened his eyes. He moved through the manor with deliberate calm, passing through rooms that held no warmth, no clutter, no signs of life beyond his own solitary existence. At the door, he paused, his reflection caught in the antique mirror, pale skin, silver hair, eyes that held too much history. The crown he'd once worn was long gone, but the weight of it still pressed against his temples some nights. Tonight, he let it fade. He opened the door. Lila stood on the other side of the gate, her small hands gripping the iron bars. She did not flinch when she saw him, did not gasp or step back. She simply tilted her head, studying him with the kind of clarity only children possess, the ability to see past surfaces to the truth beneath.
"Hello," she said.
Alaric descended the 3 stone steps to his gate and knelt. Not a shallow bow, not a token gesture. He lowered himself fully until his eyes were level with hers, until the ancient power that radiated from him like cold moonlight folded inward, restrained, contained. "Hello," he said quietly. "You said your door is broken?" Lila nodded. "It doesn't close right. Mommy pulls really hard, but the wind still comes in. And tonight she was crying because she's scared." No embellishment, no exaggeration, just facts delivered with the honesty of someone too young to know how to lie effectively. Alaric's chest tightened. "And you came to ask me for help." "You live in the big house," Lila said simply. "You look like you know how to fix things." "I do," Alaric admitted. He paused, choosing his words carefully. "But it is very late. Your mother might be worried that you left. She's asleep. She was really tired." Alaric studied her. This small, brave creature who had crossed a dark street alone because she believed someone might help. Logic told him to send her home. Caution told him to keep the gate closed. But the vow whispered louder. "I can look at your door," he said. "Not inside your home. Just the door itself. Would that be acceptable?" Lila's face brightened.
"Yes."
"Thank you." "You are welcome." Alaric rose and opened the gate. It swung silently on hinges that never rusted. "Stay close to me as we cross." They walked side by side through the rain-misted street. Alaric matched his pace to hers, his long coat trailing behind him like a shadow. Lila glanced up at him periodically, unafraid, as though walking with a centuries-old vampire king was the most natural thing in the world. "What's your name?" she asked. "Alaric Nightborn." "That's a fancy name." "It is rather old-fashioned," he agreed, a hint of something almost like amusement touching his voice. "I'm Lila. Lila Moore." "It is a pleasure to meet you, Lila Moore." They reached the rental house. Its single porch light flickered weakly, casting uneven shadows across the sagging steps. The door hung slightly crooked in its frame, the gap at the top clearly visible even from the street. Alaric's expression darkened. Not with anger, but with recognition. He had seen doors like this before. Too many times. Lila pushed the door open. "Mommy? Someone's here to help." Evelyn appeared in the narrow hallway, her face still creased from the couch cushion where she'd fallen asleep. Her eyes found Lila first, relief, then traveled upward to the figure standing just outside her door. She froze. Alaric stood in the threshold of light and shadow, tall and pale and utterly still. Everything about him seemed wrong for the hour, for the neighborhood, for the situation. Too formal, too composed, too other. Her heart kicked against her ribs. But Lila was calm, standing beside him, smiling. "Lila, get inside," Evelyn said, her voice tight. "It's okay, Mommy. This is Alaric. He's going to fix our door." "Lila, inside." The little girl hesitated, then obeyed, slipping past her mother into the house. Evelyn stepped forward, positioning herself between her daughter and the stranger. "I don't know who you are, but—" "My name is Alaric Nightborn," he said, his voice low and steady. "I live across the street. Your daughter came to my gate and asked if I could repair your door. I agreed to examine it. Nothing more." Evelyn's hands trembled. She shouldn't have done that. She shouldn't have bothered you. "She did not bother me. It's late. You should go." Alaric did not move, did not argue. He simply met her gaze with eyes that held too much patience, too much understanding. "You are frightened. That is reasonable. I am a stranger. It is night. You do not know me."
"No."
"I don't. Then I will tell you what I am willing to offer, and you will decide." His voice remained gentle, but beneath it ran a thread of something absolute. Not threat, but certainty. "I can repair your door. I will not enter your home. I will not ask you questions. I will work, and when I am finished, I will leave. You may watch me the entire time. If at any point you wish me to stop, I will." Evelyn's jaw clenched. Pride and desperation warred across her face. "Why would you do that?" "Because everyone deserves a door that closes properly," Alaric said. "May I?" The question hung in the cold air between them. Evelyn looked at her daughter, who stood watching with absolute trust. She looked at the door, rattling faintly in its broken frame. She looked back at the man who knelt in the rain for children and spoke to mothers like their consent actually mattered. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay. Yes." Alaric inclined his head. "Thank you." He stepped onto the porch, set down his toolbox, and crouched beside the doorframe. For a moment, he simply rested his palm against the wood, and felt everything it remembered. Every night the lock failed. Every time fear crept through the gap. Every moment Evelyn had stood here alone, trying to hold the world at bay with nothing but exhausted determination. The door remembered. And now, so did he. The wood grain told its story in rings and scars. Alaric's fingers traced the doorframe with surgical precision, reading the history written in warped fibers and stress fractures. Oak, once strong, now compromised by years of moisture seeping through the gap at the top. The grain had split along natural fault lines, creating channels where cold air flowed like water finding cracks in stone. He opened his toolbox. The hinges inside were older than most of the houses on this block, maintained with a care that bordered on reverence. He selected a screwdriver, tested its weight, and began. The top hinge came away easily once he loosened the rust-welded screws. Flakes of oxidized metal drifted to the porch like red snow. Beneath the corrosion, the metal showed its age, pitted, weakened, compromised beyond simple repair. "This will need to be replaced," he said quietly. Evelyn stood in the doorway, arms wrapped around herself. "I can't afford new hinges right now. I have extras. I can't afford." "They are already paid for," Alaric said, not looking up. "Consider them borrowed if it makes you more comfortable." He felt her uncertainty like a physical presence, pride wrestling with need, shame tangling with gratitude. He did not push. He simply worked. The cold draft that had whistled through the gap grew quieter as he fitted a new hinge into place. The metal aligned perfectly, the screws biting into wood that remembered being whole. Alaric's hands moved with inhuman steadiness, no tremor, no hesitation, as though time itself slowed to match his rhythm. Lila appeared at her mother's elbow, watching intently. "Can I help?" she asked. Alaric paused. "Can you hold this?" He offered her a small brass screw. She took it carefully, cupping it in both palms like something precious. When he needed it, she handed it over with solemn focus. Alaric accepted it with equal gravity.
"Thank you," he said.
"You are an excellent assistant." Lila beamed. As Alaric worked, the house breathed its memories into him. Wood and stone, and air held trauma the way fabric held scent. He felt the echoes pressed into the doorframe, hands shaking as they pushed it closed, shoulders braced against wind and weight, quiet sobs muffled behind the barrier that never quite held. Fear lived here. Not the sharp terror of immediate danger, but the slow erosion of safety, the kind that wore you down one sleepless night at a time. He knew that fear. A memory surfaced unbidden. Another door. Another lifetime. His mother's hands, roughened by work, pushing against warped wood while winter clawed at the gaps. He had been young then, not yet transformed, not yet powerful, just a boy who understood that some things broke and stayed broken because no one came to fix them. "Go to bed, Alaric," she'd said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her arms. "I'll manage." He'd believed her. Children always did. 3 nights later, the door had given way. Not to wind, but to men who took what they wanted from those too weak to stop them. He'd been powerless then. Too small. Too human. He'd made his vow in the blood-soaked aftermath. Never again. Never helpless. Never looking away. But somewhere between that vow and the crown that came centuries later, protect had become rule, and guard had become control. Distance had replaced presence. Power had replaced proximity. He'd stopped kneeling. Alaric blinked, returning to the present. His hands had not stopped working. Muscle memory and ancient skill carried him through the repair, while his mind wandered dark corridors. He tightened the final screw on the lower hinge and tested the door's swing. It moved smoothly, evenly, without the grinding resistance that had plagued it. He examined the latch, next, the mechanism worn nearly smooth, the strike plate misaligned by years of forcing it closed. "Do you have a light?" he asked. Evelyn handed him her phone, flashlight already on. He angled it into the narrow gap between door and frame, studying the metal tongue that should slide cleanly into its housing but instead scraped and caught. He made the adjustment in silence. Small shifts. Precision measured in fractions of millimeters. When he stepped back, the door hung true in its frame for the first time in years. "Try it," he said. Evelyn moved forward hesitantly. She pushed the door closed with one hand, not the two-handed, full-body shove she'd needed before. Just one hand. The latch clicked smoothly into place. She stared at it. Her voice caught. "It's fixed." "Yes." Just like that. "The damage was not structural," Alaric said, gathering his tools. "Only neglected." He meant the door. But Evelyn heard the words land differently, and something in her chest loosened. Alaric stood, closing his toolbox. He had not crossed the threshold, had not stepped inside, had not asked to enter. Even now, he remained on the porch, respecting the boundary between help and intrusion. "Thank you," Evelyn said, and this time her voice held something besides fear. Alaric inclined his head. "You are welcome. If it troubles you again, you know where I live." He descended the steps and crossed the street, his silhouette swallowed by the darkness between street lamps. Evelyn stood alone on the porch, one hand resting on the door. She pushed it gently. It closed. She pulled the handle. It opened. She closed it again. No rattle. No whistle. No cold air creeping through gaps that had haunted her for years. Just silence. The kind of silence that felt less like emptiness and more like peace. Behind her, Lila whispered, "He's nice." Evelyn touched the door one more time, feeling the smooth wood beneath her palm, and realized she was crying. Not from fear this time. From the unfamiliar weight of relief. 3 days after the door was fixed, the street lamp outside the Moore house began working again. Evelyn noticed it on her way home from her evening shift. The corner that had been dark for months, the one she'd reported twice to the city with no response, now glowed with steady amber light. She slowed, staring up at the bulb that shouldn't be functional, then continued walking. Coincidence, she told herself. 2 days later, the broken latch on the back gate clicked smoothly when she tested it. She hadn't mentioned it to anyone, hadn't even thought about it except in passing. Yet someone had oiled the hinges, tightened the screws, realigned the catch. Evelyn stood in her narrow backyard, staring at the gate, and felt the hair rise on the back of her neck. Not from fear, exactly. From awareness. Alaric listened to the neighborhood the way others listen to music, tracking patterns, noting discordance, sensing the spaces between sounds where trouble grew. He heard Mrs. Chun 3 houses down wake at 2 a.m. every night, her heartbeat spiking with anxiety before settling again. He heard the Ramirez family's arguments through thin walls and the long silences afterward that spoke of exhaustion rather than resolution. He heard dogs barking at shadows that moved wrong, and children crying from nightmares that weren't entirely dreams. And he heard the Moore house breathing easier. Evelyn's sleep had deepened. Not much. She still woke twice each night, instinct checking on Lila, but the quality had changed. Less brittle. Less braced for catastrophe. Lila's laughter came more frequently now, bright and unguarded. The door stayed closed. Alaric had not approached them again, had not knocked or offered further assistance. He simply adjusted things. A loose board on their porch step, secured before someone twisted an ankle. The motion sensor light that had been dark for weeks, suddenly functional. Small interventions. Invisible corrections. He told himself it was practical. Efficient. A door was useless if the porch collapsed, if predators found easy access through other vulnerabilities. But late at night, when he stood at his window and watched the warm glow from their living room, he knew he was lying to himself. This wasn't a strategy. It was care. Lila began waving at his house. The first time, Alaric had been standing at his window, hidden behind curtains he rarely opened, when she emerged for school. She'd looked directly at his window, lifted her small hand, and waved with absolute confidence that someone was watching. She was right, of course. Alaric had lifted his hand in return, though he doubted she could see him through the darkened glass. But the next morning, she waved again. And the morning after that. By the end of the week, it had become a ritual. The neighborhood noticed. That man at the end, Mrs. Peterson said to her husband while walking past the Nightbourne manor. Alaric heard every word from his study. Fix the Moore girls' door. In the middle of the night, they say. Strange, her husband replied. Charitable, Mrs. Peterson corrected. Though I wonder what he wants. Maybe he's just being neighborly. Nobody's just neighborly anymore. The rumors rippled outward. Some said Evelyn had made a deal. Others said the strange man was wealthy, eccentric, looking for a project. A few suggested something darker, a predator establishing trust before taking advantage. Alaric listened without reaction. He had heard worse things about him across centuries. Mortals always needed narratives to explain what they didn't understand. He would not correct them, would not defend himself. He would simply continue. Evelyn's gratitude became a weight she didn't know how to carry. She wanted to thank him properly, to bring something, offer something, acknowledge the debt accumulating with each small repair. But approaching his house felt presumptuous. What did you give someone who clearly wanted nothing? How did you repay help you'd never asked for? The fear of dependence gnawed at her. She'd built her life on self-reliance after Lila's father left, after her family stopped calling, after she learned that asking for help usually came with strings attached. But Alaric's strings, if they existed, remained invisible. He never knocked, never reminded her of what he'd done, never appeared when she could thank him, just fixed things, and disappeared. It should have been comforting. Instead, it left her off balance, uncertain, waiting for the moment when the cost would be named. Alaric stood at his window one evening, watching Evelyn pull into her driveway after work. She looked tired but steady. Lila bounded out of the car, backpack bouncing. Ruling had been simpler, he reflected. When he'd worn the crown, people knew what he wanted. Obedience, tribute, order. The exchange was clear. Power flowed in one direction, fear in the other. But guarding, true guarding, required something more complex. It required presence without possession, protection without control, care without claiming. It required him to give without taking. He'd forgotten how to do that. Or perhaps he'd never truly learned. The Moore house door opened and closed, smoothly, perfectly, and Alaric felt something settle in his chest. Not satisfaction, exactly. Something quieter. Something that might have been the purpose, rediscovered after centuries of absence. He turned from the window and froze. Across the street, partially hidden behind a parked car, a figure stood motionless, watching the Moore house. The posture was wrong, too still, too focused. Not a neighbor. Not someone passing by. Alaric's eyes narrowed. The figure remained for another 30 seconds, then moved away, slowly, deliberately, memorizing what it had seen. Alaric tracked the sound of retreating footsteps until they faded beyond his hearing range. Then he pulled out his phone and made a note. Someone had noticed the Moore house. And not in the way neighbors noticed. In this way, predators noticed prey. The prowler returned on a moonless night, when shadows pooled thick between street lamps and the neighborhood slept its deepest sleep. He'd been watching for a week. I learned the patterns. The mother worked late Tuesdays and Thursdays, came home exhausted. Lights out by 10:30. The kids' bedroom faced the backyard. Easier access, fewer witnesses. The house was small, isolated on the end of the block, separated from neighbors by overgrown hedges and neglect.
Perfect.
He'd done this before. Knew how to read a place. Single mothers were always good marks, too tired to be vigilant, too proud to ask for help, too alone to have backup. This one looked particularly worn down. The kind who'd freeze instead of fight. The kind who'd give him what he wanted just to make him leave. He approached from the side street, keeping to the darkness between pools of lamplight. I wore dark clothes, soft shoes. Carried nothing that would make noise. He'd learned to move like water, formless, patient, inevitable. The Moore house sat quiet ahead of him. One window glowed faintly, a nightlight, probably. Good. Meant the kid was young. The mother would cooperate to keep her daughter safe. He crossed into the yard and stopped. Something felt wrong. The air had changed, thickened, like walking from air conditioning into humidity, except it was cold, the kind of cold that had weight, that pressed against skin like an unwelcome hand. He shook it off. Adrenaline, probably. First night jitters. He'd feel better once he was inside. He moved toward the back gate. The one he'd watched the mother use. The one that had been broken until recently. He reached for the latch. His hand stopped 6 inches away. Not because he chose to stop. Because something made him stop. Some instinct older than thought, deeper than reason, screaming at him to reconsider. He forced his hand forward. The cold intensified. His fingers trembled, not from fear, he told himself, but from the temperature. From the wind that had picked up suddenly, pressing against him like resistance. The gate remained closed. He moved toward the back door instead. Easier to force anyway. He pulled a pry bar from his jacket, positioned himself at the frame. Light exploded across the yard. Floodlights ignited from 3 directions. The back porch, the side of the house, the neighbor's fence line. Bright, blinding, impossibly coordinated. He stumbled backward, raising his arm against the glare. Motion sensors his rational mind supplied. Just motion sensors. But he hadn't triggered them approaching. Hadn't set them off testing the gate. They'd waited. Watched him. Let him get close enough to commit before illuminating his intent. Fear spiked through his chest. He turned to run and felt it, a presence. Not physical. Not visible. But there. Standing between him and escape. Vast and ancient and absolutely implacable. Like staring at a wall that had no edges, no end. Only the certainty that it would not move. The message was clear.
Leave. Now.
Do not return. He fled. Crashed through hedges. Stumbled over roots. Ran with the kind of panic that obliterated pride and planning and everything except the primal need to escape. He didn't look back. Didn't slow down until he'd crossed 3 blocks and his lungs burned and his legs gave out beneath a broken street lamp. He sat on the curb, gasping, trying to understand what had happened. The house had been empty. No one had chased him. No one shouted. No alarm had sounded. But he'd felt something. Something that looked at him and found him wanting. Something that made him remember being small and helpless and prey instead of predator. He would not go back. Not to that house. Not to that block. Not ever. Inside the Moore house, Evelyn woke. She lay still listening. The quality of silence had changed, less peaceful, more alert. Like the air after lightning strikes, charged and waiting. She slipped out of bed and moved to the window. The backyard was illuminated, floodlights blazing. She hadn't installed floodlights. Couldn't afford them. Yet there they were, mounted exactly where they should be to eliminate every shadow. Her heart hammered. She checked Lila's room. The little girl slept peacefully, undisturbed, her small chest rising and falling with a steady rhythm of deep sleep. Nothing was broken. Nothing was disturbed, but someone had been outside. She knew it the way prey knows when predators pass nearby, some animal instinct that bypassed reason and spoke directly to survival. Evelyn returned to her window and looked across the street. The Nightbourne Manor stood dark and silent. But as she watched, a figure emerged from the shadows, tall, pale, perfectly still. Alaric stood in the middle of the street, facing her house, positioned exactly where anyone approaching would have to pass him first. He didn't move, didn't patrol, simply stand watch. Their eyes met across the distance. Evelyn raised one hand, not quite a wave, more an acknowledgement, a question, and a thank you folded together. Alaric inclined his head slightly, then turned his attention back to the street, resuming his vigil. He remained there until dawn. Not because he thought the prowler would return, fear like that didn't fade quickly enough for second attempts, but because the neighborhood needed to see him, needed to know that this street, this block, these houses were not unguarded. The night carried messages for those who knew how to listen, and Alaric's message was clear. Test this threshold again, and you will not flee. You will simply cease. The sky lightened from black to gray to pale blue. Windows began glowing with morning routines. Cars started. Doors opened. Alaric remained until Evelyn emerged with Lila, walking toward the bus stop. The little girl saw him and waved, unbothered by his presence. Evelyn met his eyes once more, her expression unreadable, fear and gratitude, and something that might have been understanding. Only when they turned the corner did Alaric finally return to his manor. The door closed behind him with a sound like finality. The street breathed easier. And the Moore house stood intact, its threshold unbroken, its inhabitants safe.
For now.
Evelyn knocked on Alaric's door at 3 in the afternoon, while Lila was still at school and the sun hung bright enough to make shadows seem absurd. She'd spent the morning rehearsing what she'd say. Discarded a dozen approaches. Settled finally on the simplest truth. She needed answers. The door opened before her knuckles left the wood. Alaric stood in the threshold, dressed in dark slacks and a pressed shirt, looking exactly as composed at midday as he had standing vigil at dawn. His eyes flickered with something that might have been surprising, though it vanished too quickly to name. Mrs. Moore. Evelyn, she corrected, her voice steadier than she felt. Can we talk? He stepped aside. Of course. Would you like to come in? She hesitated. Crossing his threshold felt significant in ways she couldn't articulate, but standing on his porch felt cowardly. Yes. The interior of the Nightbourne Manor was nothing like she'd expected. No cobwebs, no gothic excess, no theatrical darkness. Just clean lines, minimal furniture, and an overwhelming sense of absence, as though the house had been curated to reveal nothing about who lived there. Alaric gestured toward a sitting room. Please. Evelyn sat on the edge of an immaculate chair. Alaric remained standing, hands clasped loosely behind his back, the posture of someone accustomed to formal audiences. Someone tried to break into my house last night, she said without preamble. Yes. The lights came on. Lights I didn't install. Yes. And you were standing in the street when I looked outside. Alaric inclined his head. Yes. Evelyn's hands clenched at her lap. I need to know why. Not what you are, I don't care if you're. She gestured vaguely. Whatever you are.
But why?
Why fix my door? Why protect my house? Why stand guard over people you don't know? Silence stretched between them. Alaric moved to the window, his back to her, silhouette sharp against the afternoon light. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of centuries. A long time ago, I made a vow. Before I had power. Before I understood what power cost. He paused. I swore to protect those who could not protect themselves. Not as subjects. As neighbors. As equals. But I failed. The words came quietly, each one measured. There was a woman. A mother, like you. Her door was broken. I was young, still human, and I told myself someone else would help. That it wasn't my responsibility. That she would manage. Evelyn's throat tightened. 3 days later, her house was broken into. She was killed defending her son. Alaric's shoulders tensed. I became what I am shortly after. Gained the power to ensure I would never be helpless again. Never too weak to intervene. But somewhere in acquiring that power, I forgot the original vow. I learned to rule instead of guard. To control instead of protect. I stopped kneeling. He turned to face her. Your daughter reminded me of what I'd forgotten. That protection is not about dominion. It is about presence. Evelyn stood, anger and confusion tangling in her chest. So, I'm what, your redemption project? Your chance to fix a centuries-old mistake.
No.
Alaric's voice was firm. You are not a project. You are a mother who has survived impossible circumstances with grace and strength, who has kept her child safe and loved despite every obstacle placed in your path, who braced a broken door every night and still got up every morning. You are not weak, Evelyn. You never were. Then why do I feel weak? The question escaped before she could stop it. Why do I feel like I'm drowning, and you're the only thing keeping me afloat? Because you have been strong without rest for too long. Alaric crossed the room slowly, carefully, stopping at a respectful distance. Because strength without relief is simply exhaustion in disguise. Because asking for help is not weakness. It is wisdom. Something cracked in Evelyn's chest. I didn't ask.
No.
You didn't. Your daughter did. And perhaps that is the point. His eyes softened. Children understand what adults forget, that we are meant to help each other. That isolation is not independence. That accepting care does not diminish you, it sustains you. Evelyn's vision blurred. She pressed her palms against her eyes, trying to stop the tears, but they came anyway, hot and sudden and laced with something that felt dangerously close to hope. I can't pay you back, she whispered. Whatever this costs. It costs nothing. Everything costs something. Then it costs me the privilege of remembering who I was meant to be. Alaric's voice gentled further. You have already given me that. The debt, if there is one, is mine. Evelyn lowered her hands, looked at him through tear-blurred vision, and saw something she hadn't expected. Vulnerability. This ancient, powerful being, standing in his empty manor, speaking of failures and vows, was just as lonely as she was, just as desperate to matter. I don't know how to do this, she admitted. How to accept help. How to trust that it won't be taken away. Neither do I, Alaric said. But perhaps we can learn together. The words hung between them, an offer and an admission folded into one. A small sound from the doorway made them both turn. Lila stood there, backpack still on, having let herself in through the open door. Her eyes moved between her mother's tear-stained face and Alaric's careful distance. Without hesitation, she crossed the room and positioned herself between them, not as a barrier, but as a bridge. She took her mother's hand, then reached up and took Alaric's. We're okay now, she said with the absolute certainty of childhood. Right? Evelyn looked at her daughter, at the strange, ancient man who'd fixed their door and stood guard in the darkness, at the space between loneliness and connection that suddenly felt crossable. Yes, she whispered. We're okay. Alaric knelt slowly, bringing himself to Lila's height. Yes, he agreed. You're safe. Both of you. I give you my word. Lila smiled. I know. They left together, mother and daughter walking across the street toward their house, where the door closed properly and the lights worked and the shadows held no threats. Evelyn paused at her porch and looked back. Alaric stood at his window, watching. Not hovering. Not controlling. Just present. She raised her hand in acknowledgement. He returned the gesture. And for the first time since Lila's father had left, since her family had stopped calling, since she'd learned that asking for help usually meant owing something you couldn't afford to give, Evelyn allowed herself to believe she was not alone. The power died at 2:47 a.m. Not gradually, no flickering, no brownout, no warning. One moment the street lamps glowed their steady amber, and the next, darkness swallowed the entire block whole. Refrigerators fell silent. Digital clocks blinked into non-existence. The low hum of electricity that modern humans had learned not to hear simply stopped. Alaric was already at his window. He'd felt it coming for the past hour, a disturbance in the fabric of the night, like pressure building before a storm. The air had grown dense, expectant. Dogs 3 blocks away had begun barking in unison, then fallen abruptly silent. Birds had abandoned their roosts early, fleeing something they couldn't name but understood instinctively. Something old had noticed him, and now it has come to investigate. The darkness beyond his window was wrong. Not mere absence of light, but presence of something that displaced light, that pushed it back and claimed the space for itself. It rolled through the street like fog, but thicker, heavier, conscious. Alaric opened his door and stepped outside. The cold hit him first, not winter cold, but the bone-deep chill of places where warmth had never existed. The kind of cold that predated fire, predated the sun, predated the concept of shelter. His breath should have misted. Instead, it simply disappeared, swallowed by air that refused to hold anything living. He descended his steps and walked to the center of a street. The darkness coalesced. It had no shape, or rather, it had too many shapes, shifting between forms that human minds couldn't fully process. Sometimes it looked like smoke. Sometimes like oil spreading across water. Sometimes like the absence carved into reality, where something massive had been removed. But always, always it watched. Alaric felt its attention settle on him like a physical weight. Ancient recognition passed between them. Predator acknowledging predator. Power measuring power. You, it whispered without sound. King of the dead things. Why do you guard the living? Because they need guarding, Alaric said quietly. From me? From everything. The darkness rippled, something that might have been amusement. You cannot stop me. You know this. I am older than your crown. Older than your power. I was feeding when your kind still crawled in caves. Perhaps. Alaric's voice remained level. But you will not feed here.
Why?
Genuine curiosity now. What are they to you? Food you're saving for later? Toys you wish to keep intact? They are under my protection. Protection. The word twisted in the darkness, like something bitter. You wear it like righteousness, but we both know the truth. You are no guardian. You are a king, and kings protect their territory, not their subjects. Alaric was silent for a long moment. Then, I was a king.
Once.
I learned what that cost. He took a step forward. Not aggressive. Not theatrical. Simply present. Placing himself between the darkness and the sleeping houses behind him. I am not here to fight you, he continued. I am not here to hunt you or destroy you. But I am here. And that is where I will remain. You think your presence is enough? I think, Alaric said, that you will not cross this line while I stand on it. Not because you cannot, but because you remember what happens when boundaries are tested by those who enforce law rather than crave conquest. The darkness stilled. Law, it repeated. You claim to be law? I claim nothing. I simply am what I am. The refusal that stands between hunger and home. You may test me if you wish, but know that I will not tire. I will not sleep. will not negotiate or compromise or step aside. You will break me, or you will leave. There is no third option. Silence. The darkness pressed closer, a test, a probe, searching for weakness or hesitation. Alaric stood motionless. His power unfurled around him, not as a weapon but as a barrier, an absolute statement that this far and no farther. The Moore house stood behind him. Evelyn and Lila slept, unaware, trusting that the door would hold, and the night would pass, and morning would come as it always had.
They should not have to know about this.
Should not have to understand that darkness sometimes had consciousness, had will, had appetite. That was the point of protection, not glory, not gratitude, but the gift of ignorance. The freedom to sleep without fear. The entity circled, testing the perimeter. Found it sealed. Every angle was blocked. Every approach was denied. You would stand here until dawn? And the dawn after that. And every night thereafter. For what? They do not even know you saved them. Good, Alaric said simply. That is how it should be. The darkness regarded him for a long moment. Then something shifted, not retreat, exactly, but recognition. Acknowledgement. Perhaps you are not what you were, it whispered. Perhaps you have remembered something I forgot long ago. Perhaps we both have. The presence began to dissipate. Not fleeing, but withdrawing. Choosing easier prey elsewhere, places where no ancient thing stood watch with the patience of stone and the stubbornness of oaths too old to break. I will not return here, it said. Not while you remain. Then we understand each other. The darkness pulled back like a tide receding from shore. The oppressive cold lifted. The wrongness in the air dissolved. And at 4:23 a.m., the power returned, lights flickering back to life, refrigerators humming their familiar song, the digital world rebooting as though nothing had paused. Alaric remained in the street until the sky shifted from black to gray, until the first birds sang, until Mrs. Chen's alarm clock chimed at 5:30 and she rose to start her morning routine, completely unaware that the night had tested her neighborhood and been turned away. Only then did he return to his manor. By 7 a.m., the block had awakened fully. Children waited for buses. Adults rushed to cars. Someone mentioned the power outage at the coffee shop. Strange, localized, no explanation from the utility company. Probably just a blown transformer, someone said. Everyone agreed. No one noticed that the street lamps had remained lit throughout. No one remarked that no alarm had been triggered, no emergency services called. The night had held its breath and released it without incident. The Moore house door opened. Evelyn emerged with Lila, both bundled against the morning chill. Lila waved at the night-born manor, as she always did. This time, Alaric stood visible at his window. He raised his hand in return, a simple gesture that meant everything and nothing. You are safe. You remain safe. You will continue to be safe. Evelyn paused, studying him. Something in his posture spoke of exhaustion carefully hidden. Of vigils kept and prices paid in silence. She placed her hand over her heart, then extended it toward him. Gratitude without words, understanding without explanation. Alaric inclined his head. The street moved on with its morning, ordinary and precious and completely unaware that it still existed because one ancient thing had refused to let another take it. That was protection. Not a spectacle, just presence. And the absolute certainty that some thresholds would not be crossed. 6 months changed everything and nothing. The Moore house still leaned slightly away from the curb. Paint still peeled in places Evelyn couldn't afford to repair. But the door closed properly. The lights worked. And the fear that had lived in the walls like dampness had finally dried out, leaving only the ordinary concerns of ordinary life. Evelyn walked differently now. Shoulders back. Eyes forward. The exhaustion hadn't vanished. Single motherhood didn't allow for that luxury, but it no longer bent her spine or stole her voice. She'd started taking evening shifts by choice rather than desperation, had opened a savings account, had begun to imagine futures beyond simply surviving until morning. At the coffee shop, she laughed with other parents. At the grocery store, She made eye contact. Small things. Foundational things. The armor of isolation had cracked, and underneath, she discovered she was still capable of joy. Lila had grown 2 inches and gained a confidence that bordered on fearlessness. She no longer whispered, no longer watched her mother with the worried vigilance of children who'd learned too early that adults could break. She climbed trees, scraped knees, brought home artwork covered in paint and pride. And twice a week, she crossed the street to visit Alaric. The first time, Evelyn had hesitated. You don't have to, he's probably busy. He said I could visit whenever I wanted. Lila had replied with the simple certainty of someone who'd been told the truth and believed it. She'd been right. Alaric taught her to fix things. Not with magic or supernatural precision, but with patience and proper tools. How to tighten a screw without stripping it. How to identify which hinge needed oil by listening to the sound it made. How to read a space and understand what it needed before it broke completely. Why do you know all this stuff? Lila asked one afternoon, sitting cross-legged on his porch while he demonstrated how to splice a frayed wire. Because things break, Alaric said simply. And someone should know how to fix them. But you're really old, right? Like, really old. A pause. Then, with something almost like amusement. Yes, very old. So you've fixed a lot of stuff. More than I can count. Lila considered this. Do you get tired of it? Fixing things. Alaric looked at her. This small, bright creature who'd knocked on his gate at midnight and reminded him why he'd made his vow in the first place. No, he said quietly. I don't. The neighborhood had changed, too. Not dramatically. No one suddenly became best friends or organized block parties. But the small fractures that divided people, the grudges, the gossip, the careful avoidance, had begun to heal. Mrs. Chen's porch light stayed on now, fixed by hands she never saw. The Ramirez family's arguments grew quieter, then less frequent, then stopped altogether after someone anonymously paid their overdue utility bill. Mr. Okonkwo's car started every morning despite being 20 years old, maintained by a neighbor he'd never met. People began to notice each other again. To wave. To pause for conversation instead of rushing past. The street felt less like a collection of isolated houses and more like a place where people actually lived together. No one knew why. No one connected the changes to the quiet man at the end of the block who walked at odd hours and never seemed to sleep. But Evelyn knew. She watched him move through the neighborhood like a ghost with purpose, adjusting, repairing, redirecting small disasters before they became catastrophic. Never asking for acknowledgement. Never expecting gratitude. Just caring. The way people were supposed to care for each other, but so rarely did. The Nightbourne Manor felt different now. Still immaculate. Still formal. But no longer suffocating in its emptiness. Lila's laughter echoed through rooms that hadn't heard children in centuries. Her drawings appeared on the refrigerator Alaric never used, crayon depictions of houses and families, and a tall figure with kind eyes labeled Alaric in wobbly letters. He hadn't corrected the spelling. Evelyn visited too, though less frequently. Brought coffee sometimes, sat on his porch while Lila played in the yard, talked about ordinary things, work, weather, Lila's progress in school. Never pressing. Never demanding. Just present. Alaric found himself looking forward to those moments. The brief intrusions of warmth into his carefully controlled isolation. The reminder that protection wasn't just about standing watch in darkness, but about being available in daylight. About being part of something rather than apart from everything. One evening, as Evelyn gathered Lila to go home, she paused at the gate.
Thank you, she said.
Not for anything specific. For everything. For the accumulation of small mercies that had rebuilt her life. Alaric shook his head. You've given me far more than I've given you. I don't think that's true. Then we are even. Evelyn smiled, genuine, unguarded. Then we're even. The weather report came 3 days later. Severe storm system moving in. High winds. Heavy rain. Potential for flooding and power outages. Residents advised to secure outdoor furniture and check emergency supplies. Evelyn stood in her kitchen, listening to the forecast, and felt the old fear flicker in her chest. Just for a moment. Just long enough to remember nights when storms meant danger and broken doors and cold creeping through gaps that wouldn't close. Then she looked at her door, solid, secure, properly maintained. Looked across the street at the manor where a light burned steadily in the window. And the fear subsided. Storms came. That was inevitable. But this time, she wasn't facing them alone. This time, the door would hold. And if it didn't, she knew exactly who would fix it. That night, as wind began to build and the first drops of rain spattered against windows, Alaric stood at his usual post. Watching. Listening. Ready. The storm rolled in like a memory, testing the neighborhood's weak points, probing for vulnerabilities. But the street had changed. Reinforced. Protected. And the vampire king who'd once ruled from a throne now stood guard in the darkness, crown forgotten, power bent toward a single, simple purpose.
Keep them safe.
The storm howled at its arrival. Alaric did not move. And across the street, behind a door that closed properly, Evelyn Moore slept peacefully beside her daughter, trusting, for the first time in years, that morning would come. The storm that had been forecast arrived with theatrical fury, wind that bent trees horizontally, rain that fell in sheets thick enough to obscure the street, thunder that shook windows in their frames. Inside the Moore house, Lila sat at the kitchen table working on homework while Evelyn prepared dinner. The lights flickered once but held. The house creaked in familiar ways, settling into the weather like an old ship riding waves. Then came the sound, a soft scraping, followed by the telltale whistle of air finding a gap it shouldn't. Evelyn looked up. The front door had shifted slightly in its frame, swollen by humidity, the wood expanding just enough to make the latch stick. Not broken, just temperamental. The way doors got during storms. 6 months ago, that sound would have sent ice through her veins. Now, she simply sighed and set down her spatula. Lila, the door's acting up again. Lila looked up from her math worksheet, assessed the situation with the casual competence of someone who'd learned to notice these things, and grinned. I'll get the tools. She bounded toward the small closet where they now kept a basic toolkit, nothing fancy, just what was necessary. Screwdrivers, a hammer, oil for hinges, wood shims for adjustments. Things Alaric had taught her to use. Things she no longer feared. Evelyn moved to the door and tested it. Definitely stuck. The wood had swollen at the top corner, probably from moisture seeping through a gap in the weather stripping. Fixable. Annoying, but fixable. She pulled out her phone and typed quickly. Doors being stubborn. Want to help us fix it? The response came within seconds. On my way. Alaric arrived 3 minutes later, carrying his toolbox and wearing a raincoat that was somehow still perfectly dry despite the downpour. He shook off the worst of the weather on the porch and smiled, a small, genuine expression that had become less rare over the months. Storm got it, he asked. Storm got it, Evelyn confirmed. Lila appeared with their toolkit, presenting it proudly. I brought everything. Excellent preparation, Alaric said, setting his own box beside hers. Let's see what we're working with. They gathered around the door like a surgical team, Lila holding the flashlight from her phone, Evelyn studying the frame, Alaric examining the swollen corner with fingers that could read wood grain like text. It just needs adjustment, he said. The weather stripping has come loose here, letting moisture in. We'll reseal it and shave down this edge slightly. Can I do the screwdriver part? Lila asked. Absolutely. Evelyn, can you hold the steady while she works? No hierarchy. No one did while others watched. Just 3 people working together to fix a problem that affected them all. Lila carefully removed the screws holding the weather stripping, her tongue poking out in concentration. Evelyn held the door frame stable, watching her daughter work with a pride that had nothing to do with perfection and everything to do with capability. Alaric guided gently. A bit more pressure there. Good. Now the next one. but let Lila do the actual work. When the stripping was removed, Evelyn held it while Alaric applied fresh adhesive. Lila pressed it back into place, smoothing it down with small, careful hands. "Now we test," Alaric said. Evelyn pushed the door closed. It moved smoothly, settled into place with a satisfying click. No stick, no whistle, just the clean sound of something working the way it was meant to.
"Perfect," she said.
"We fixed it," Lila announced, holding up her hand for a high five. Alaric obliged, his ancient palm meeting her small one with gentle precision. "We did," he agreed. "Good work, team." Team. Not helper and helped. Not protector and protected. Just team. They stood together on the porch for a moment, watching the storm rage beyond the shelter. Rain pounded the street. Wind howled through power lines. Lightning split the sky in brilliant forks. But the door behind them was solid. The house was warm. And the three of them stood together, tools in hand, proof that some things could be maintained rather than endured. "Next time it sticks, will you help again?" Lila asked, looking up at Alaric with absolute trust. "Every time," he promised. "For as long as you need me. What if we don't need you anymore?" Lila's question was innocent, curious, not cruel. What if we get really good at fixing things ourselves? Alaric knelt, as he always did when speaking to her about important things, and met her eyes with the full weight of his sincerity. "Then I will be proud," he said quietly. "And I will still be across the street, if you ever want company while you work." Evelyn's throat tightened. She reached out and placed her hand on Alaric's shoulder, the first time she'd initiated touch. He looked up at her, surprise flickering across his features.
"Thank you," she said.
"Not just for this. For everything. For teaching us that asking for help isn't a weakness. That accepting care isn't debt. That we can be strong and supported." "You taught me the same," Alaric said. "That protection is not possession. That presence is not controlled. That guarding does not require distance. It requires the opposite." The storm continued its assault on the world beyond the porch. But here, in this small circle of light, three people stood together, bound not by obligation or debt, but by something simpler and infinitely more valuable.
Choice. Care.
The deliberate decision to show up for each other, storm after storm, door after door, for as long as it mattered, which was to say, forever. Later, after Alaric had returned to his manor and Lila had gone to bed, Evelyn stood at her window watching the storm. The neighborhood was dark except for scattered lights burning in windows, each one a small declaration that people lived here, persisted here, built lives here despite everything that tried to tear them down. Across the street, the Nightbourne Manor stood as it always had, immaculate, ancient, watchful, but no longer empty, no longer separate. Part of the street now, part of the community, part of something larger than solitude. The door behind Evelyn was closed, properly sealed, ready for whatever came next. And in the darkness beyond the street lamps, the night itself seemed to listen, searching for vulnerability, for weakness, for some crack through which fear could seep. It found nothing, just a house that was warm, a door that was whole, and a neighborhood that had learned, finally, what it meant to be protected not by walls, but by presence, not by power, but by care. The storm would pass. They always did. And in the morning, the street would wake, ordinary, precious, and utterly unaware that it stood as proof of something profound. That broken things could be fixed. That lonely people could find family. That ancient vows, once forgotten, could be remembered. And that sometimes the difference between despair and hope was as simple as a door that closed properly, and someone who cared enough to make sure it stayed that way. And there it is. A door that closes. A family that's whole. A street that finally feels safe. If this story touched something in you, if you felt Evelyn's exhaustion, Lila's courage, or Alaric's quiet redemption, then I've done what I set out to do. Stories aren't just entertainment. They're reminders of what we're capable of, protection without possession, strength with gentleness, and love that asks nothing in return. Here's what I need from you. Subscribe. Not for me, for you. Because tomorrow I'm bringing another story just as rich, just as intentional, and you deserve to have it waiting when you need it.